Welcome back, kind of. So we're going to just jump right in. We talked a lot about logic and logical fallacies over the last couple of weeks. Now we are going to move into classical argument. This is mostly just history and notes regarding classical argument, but I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can apply these elements of classical argument to your own arguments when you write. So we're going to get into all of the elements of what a good argument looks like and how you're going to use those in your own writing in order to be really effective in your argument writing. So here we go. So our two essential questions for this lesson, first of all, are what is classical argument and also what are its components. So when we talk about classical argument, that's not just a generic adjective, classical. It's actually talking about something very specific. So I'm going to get into that in just a minute. And then the components are what are all the different pieces. So in the past, you've learned about introductions, body, conclusion, evidence, counter argument, and we're going to talk about those things. We're going to use some very specific language when we talk about that, and I think it might help clarify things. Weirdly enough, even though we're going to be using some Latin. So here we go. So first of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about rhetoric. We've talked about this all year, especially last semester. We talked about rhetorical analysis, and three of the major rhetorical appeals. We're going to talk about a fourth major rhetorical appeal today, which should sound pretty familiar to you. So, first of all, the study of rhetoric has existed for thousands of years, predating even Socrates, Plato, and the other great ancient Greek philosophers that we often credit as the founders of Western philosophy. And although ancient rhetoric is most commonly associated with the ancient Greeks and Romans, early examples of rhetoric date all the way back to ancient Akkadian writings in Mesopotamia. In ancient Greece and Rome, rhetoric was most often considered to be the art of persuasion, and I've said this over and over and over throughout the year. And it was primarily described as a spoken skill. In these societies, discourse occurred almost exclusively in the public sphere, so learning the art of effective convincing speaking was essential for public orators, legal experts, politicians, philosophers, generals, and educators. To prepare for the speeches they would need to make in these roles, students engaged in written exercises called progymnasmata. And that's essentially what you are going to be doing in your argument writing, progymnasmata. It's a matter of preparation. So freestyle argument is great, but to be an effective freestyle arguer, I should say, you've got to get really, really good at it. And most of us are not, as we're starting to realize as we practice more and more. And part of the reason why is because our argument is strategic, and in being strategic, we have to be very deliberate in our planning. We have to kind of look at argument as almost like a game of chess. We talked a little bit about this when we talked about fallacies, and in order to construct a really effective argument, you need to be prepared. So back to the notes. Today, rhetorical scholars still use strategies from the classical era to conceptualize argument. However, whereas oral discourse was the main focus of the classical rhetoricians, modern scholars also study the peculiarities of written argument. So finally, Aristotle provides a crucial point of reference for ancient and modern scholars alike. Over 2,000 years ago, Aristotle literally wrote the book on rhetoric. His text Rhetoricae, which is, if you look for it in the library or bookstore, it's going to be called On Rhetoric, explores the techniques and purposes of persuasion in ancient Greece, laying the foundation for the study and implementation of rhetoric in future generations. Though the ways we communicate and conceptualize rhetoric have changed, many of the principles in his book are still used today. And this is for good reason. Aristotle's strategies can provide a great guide for organizing your thoughts as well as writing effective arguments, essays, and speeches. So if you're looking for a rationale as to why we're studying classical argument in order to construct good arguments, that's it right there. It's really worked for thousands of years. It continues to work today. And what you'll see when we start going through this information is this is not new information, but these are not necessarily things that you have thought this deeply about, or maybe you have. But part of being a strong analyst is being able to break something apart into smaller pieces and look very closely at it, and that's exactly what we're going to be doing. So just to review, three of these four you should be familiar with, but we're going to be looking at four major rhetorical appeals, and the first one is ethos or ethos, depending on your preference. And we've talked about this. This is the appeal to credibility. Some texts you'll look at, and I don't know why people do this, and you're gonna run into these arguments sometimes, and all I can tell you is that anytime someone tells you that ethos is ethics, they're wrong, and you should tell them that. Just kidding, don't tell them that. But when we talk about ethos as a rhetorical appeal, it's an appeal to credibility. So this is the way that you as the speaker or writer, or whoever's speaking or writing, presents themselves to the audience. Speakers and writers can build credibility by doing a lot of different things. For example, citing professional sources. So when we look back at our fallacies, for example, we looked at whether or not the sources that people use, or the evidence that people use, or the expertise that people use is actually expertise in that specific field. So we got to be really careful about what we use, and making sure that it does work within the logic of the argument. Also using content-specific language. So when doctors speak, for example, they use medical jargon. And despite the fact that maybe we don't always necessarily understand that jargon, and obviously this all depends on the context of the argument, or the specific event that's occurring while this is happening, we tend to trust doctors more when they use the language of their profession. And this is why it's really important to be very, very deliberate in the words that we choose, and how careful we are in the things that we say, because part of what we're doing when we're arguing is we are presenting ourselves as experts. And so, like I said, all of these pieces work together. When we talk about the rhetorical situation, who's the speaker, who's the audience, what's the purpose, what's the context, what's the exigence, so much of that, well, not so much, all of that dictates, the language we use, the words we use, the way we construct our sentences. And this is just another example of that. And then finally, showing evidence of your ethical, knowledgeable background. So your expertise really needs to come through. Think about those people who have expertise in a specific field, that if you have a specific question that you want to ask and get the best possible information about it, you're going to go to the person who's an expert. And so they're going to talk to you, and they're going to use that expertise in order to present a credible argument. Okay, logos. So we've talked a lot about logos. And I know that prior to the last couple of weeks, logos has just been facts and statistics. But obviously, when we look at things like deductive and inductive reasoning, we recognize that logos isn't just a matter of hard facts and data, although those are really, really important components. So logos is the appeal to logic, and this is the way that the speaker appeals to the audience through practicality and hard evidence. And you can develop logos by presenting data and statistics, which we've talked about in the past. But in the last couple of weeks, what we've also talked about is crafting a clear claim with a logically sequenced argument. So the deductive syllogism, right? That's one example of a logically sequenced argument that we have talked about. And while you're not necessarily going to use that syllogistic model in your argument, what you are going to do is you're going to use that as a test and to determine whether or not the information or evidence you're presenting is logical. Other types of logical sequences and arguments are, of course, inductive reasoning, where we have a hypothesis, we gather evidence, we evaluate that evidence, and then we take that inductive leap and arrive at a conclusion. Cause and effect is another example, which I will talk a little bit more about cause and effect and causal chains in future lessons. Okay, and of course, pathos. This is the one that I find to be oftentimes the least logical, but sometimes the most effective. So this is an appeal to emotion. This is the way that a speaker appeals to the audience through emotion, pity, or passions. Remember that pathos isn't just pity, right? It isn't just sadness. There's lots of emotions. And so we think about, ways that humor, for example, can be a pathetic appeal, where it can actually, get people to be more open to your argument. And that's exactly what you're doing with pathos. You're trying to kind of break down those emotional walls between yourself and the audience in order to get them to really come along with you in that argument and hopefully land on your side. So the idea of pathos is usually to evoke and strengthen feelings already present within the audience. This can be achieved through storytelling, vivid imagery, and an impassioned voice. So impassioned voice, keep in mind that we're not just talking about in terms of spoken language, but also written language. And how do you develop an impassioned voice through written language? You do that through diction. You do that through careful selection of language. And so when we go back to diction, when you go back and you look at that, that funny Diddles handout that I gave you that talked about word choice, that talked about diction analysis, like those are the kinds of things that we do in order to reach our audiences through emotion. Now, one that's kind of new, but if you pay close attention, this should be pretty familiar, is the logical appeal kairos. And so this is an appeal made through the adept use of time. This is the way a speaker appeals to the audience through notions of time. It's also considered to be the appropriate or opportune time for a speaker to insert herself into a conversation or discourse using the three appeals that we just talked about. A kairotic appeal can be made through calls to immediate action, presenting an opportunity as temporary, and by describing a specific moment as propitious or ideal. So, if you haven't figured it out already, this is the closest thing that we have to exigence, right? We talked about exigence and this notion that why is this particular point in time the most appropriate to make this argument? So when we talk about rhetorical analysis, we think about exigence as that specifically. Okay, so why did this person make this argument now? What event sort of catalyzed this? What is the thing that sort of pushed the speaker or the rhetor into making this argument right now? Exigence and kairos work hand in hand. Now, kairos is a little bit more deliberate in terms of strategic argument. So, in classical argument, when you had people who were up in a forum and they were speaking, understand that it wasn't just a matter of one person standing in the middle of an amphitheater talking. It was actually this really interactive event that was kind of like theater, where all of a sudden, you would have someone like Cicero, for example, he's a Roman, who'd be up there speaking, and then all of a sudden you'd have somebody come up in the middle of him speaking because they would see the opportunity to speak right now, to come in and enter the debate as being really important. So we're not concerned with debate per se, but we're also talking about why right now is the best time to be making this argument. So, for example, what more appropriate time to be thinking about kairos than right now when, presenting an argument as to why people should stay in their houses because, of social distancing, of avoiding the spreading of this particular virus, right now, like a lot of the decisions that are being made, and you'll notice that, every single day there seems to be some new kind of not mandates, but recommendations from, local, state, and federal governments with regards to how we should handle ourselves with regards to quarantine and locking ourselves down and how much time we spend in the public. And so much of this has to do with this exact thing. Now, that's obviously really important because the stakes are really high. Okay, we don't want to get people sick. And of course, when we are writing arguments, the stakes might not necessarily be as high, but you can sort of see the connection between the timing of the argument and the events that are occurring surround it. So exigence and context are really important when thinking about kairos. So I'm going to I'm going to add the slideshow to this lesson, and you can actually follow it, and you can click on this link and it gives you a little bit more information about appeals. So full disclosure, the information that I'm presenting here is from a website that is really, really useful. I've talked about it in the past. It's the Online Writing Lab at Purdue University. It's kind of like the college writing Bible website almost. It gives you everything you need to know. And if I haven't put the link to it in Google Classroom, I will. I mean, it's a good place to look for how to format a works cited page, but it also gives you a ton of information about effective writing. All right, so we've talked about logical, or not logical, but we've talked about rhetorical appeals. And now we're going to talk about the components and structure of classical argument. So in the past, we've talked about argument as being, traditional essay format. You have an introduction, you have a body, you have a conclusion. Within that, you make claims, you have evidence, you provide commentary, you address counterclaims. And we're going to talk about all of those things. We're going to use some different language for that, though. And there's a reason for this, because what I'm going to have you do in our next lesson is I'm going to have you actually build some mind maps. I'm going to have you use this specific language to build your nodes where you're going to build your information for your arguments. So the classical argument is made up of 5 components, which are most commonly composed in the following order. Okay, so it's not just a matter of these terms, but there's an actual sequence to this argument. So our first step in this is what's called the exordium, which is the introduction, opening, or hook. The second step is the narratio, which is the context or background of the topic. And then we have the propositio and partitio. This is the claim / stance and the argument. Then we have confirmatio and or refutatio, which are positive proofs and negative proofs of support. And then finally, peroratio, which is the conclusion and call to action. So starting with exordium, this is your introduction or hook. And in your exordium, you have an opportunity to gain the interest of your reader, but you also have the responsibility of situating the argument and setting the tone of your writing. That is, you should find a way to appeal to the audience's interest while also introducing the topic and its importance in a professional and considerate manner. Something to include in this section is the significance of discussing the topic in this given moment. Okay, again, kairos. And this provides the issue a sense of urgency that can validate your argument. So again, coming back around to kind of what our short-term goals with this are. Our short-term goals of all of this are to write really effective argument essays on the AP test. Okay, and the introduction to your argument is really, really important. Now, looking back at rhetorical analysis, it was not as important to write a really effective introduction because you wanted to really do all of the digging of your writing in the body. You wanted to really break down a piece of text and look at it rhetorically, and that's all occurring in the body. But in an argument, it's really, really important to be rhetorically effective from top to bottom. So there's no unimportant part of an argument essay. So the introduction is where you make your first impression. I'm going to send you some additional videos that give you some additional tips. They're kind of long. They're from a site called Fiveable, which is a site that is usually really expensive, but right now they're providing all of their resources for free because y'all are home and you have nothing else to do. But their whole goal is to provide students with more resources to score well on the AP test, and they will talk about why all of the different components of argument are really important. So in the exordium, this is also a good opportunity to consider who your intended audience is and also to address their concerns within the context of the argument. So one of the example I'm going to use as I go through these notes is if you were going to write an argument on the importance of technology in the English classroom, and I mean, coincidentally, right now, it's more important than ever. So if you're writing an argument on the importance of technology in the English classroom and your intended audience was a board member, you might consider the following. New learning possibilities for students, the necessity of modern technology in finding new up-to-date information, detailed narrative of how technology in one school vastly improved student literacy, statistics that show a link between exposure to technology and rising trends in literacy, quotes from education and technology professors expressing an urgency for technology in English classrooms, and right now more appropriately than ever in the event of a self-imposed quarantine or shutting down of schools, being able to continue learning would be a really good way to introduce your essay in the exordium. So you're not necessarily going to use all of those appeals. And so in each of those appeals, for example, the first one I talked about was new learning possibilities. Those are just addressing general audience concerns. The second one I talked about, which was the necessity of modern technology and finding new up-to-date information, that is a Kairos argument, a Kairos appeal argument, a detailed narrative of how technology in one school vastly improved student literacy. That would be one that's more emotionally based, more of a pathos argument. Statistics showing a link between exposure to technology and rising trends in literacy, that's Logos. And then quotes from education and technology professors expressing an urgency for technology in English classrooms, and that's Ethos, because we're using quotes from experts. So you can see how those appeals are especially important in your exordium, in your introduction. So you're probably not going to use all of those appeals in the opening section of your argument. You may need to choose one. If you do, it might end up being really boring and really long and doesn't function well as a hook. Because remember, your introduction needs to be both really telling, really thorough, show your expertise, but you don't want to bore your reader. Okay, you want to get into, you want to dovetail into your argument, which is going to occur in subsequent paragraphs. So some things you want to ask yourself as you are writing that introduction, what's going to be the most important to my specific audience? Here's the deal. In some of the more recent prompts, they have actually identified specific audience members. And so that's really important to keep in mind. They don't do that on accident. They do that because they want to make sure that you actually know what you're doing when you are constructing a rhetorical argument. What information will most likely result in the action I want to bring about, and then think about which appeal will work best to gain the attention of your intended audience and start there. Just a quick note, something else that you need to consider before you even get into this is making absolutely sure that you know everything you're going to talk about. So having a plan. The mind map is something that we're going to work on over the next several days, which I think is a really good and useful tool in terms of preparing and outlining an argument. You do not want to introduce things in your introduction of your argument that you're not going to get to in the body of your argument. Okay, so make sure that you're really careful, that you know exactly what you're going to talk about. All right, our next item is narratio. And this is where you provide relevant foundational information and describe the social context in which your topic exists. This might include information on the historical background, including recent changes or updates to the topic, social perception, important events, and other academic research. This helps to establish the rhetorical situation for the argument, that is, the situation the argument is currently in, as impacted by events, people, opinion, and urgency of some kind. One of the things that you're going to notice in the argument prompts as I send them to you, and unfortunately I wish I would have given you your booklets before everything got shut down, but you're going to get a digital copy of them. But when you look through the prompts, some of the prompts are going to be sort of philosophical in nature, and they're going to be talking about ideas that are universal and kind of evergreen, which is just another way of saying timeless. And other ones are very, very specific, of a specific time, that ask for you to really think about context. But you can contextualize everything, because almost every single prompt, I would say every single prompt, but I'm not 100% sure. But almost every single prompt will ask you to use evidence that comes from personal experience, observation, or your reading. And when you're using personal experience, when you're using observations, you're going to talk about stuff that is present tense. And so this is where you can contextualize your argument. So back to the example of the technology argument in the classroom, some things that you might include in the narratio section or the background section would be advances in education-related technology over the centuries. So you can go everything from, the advent of the classroom to public school to Google Classroom. I mean, education has evolved tremendously. Okay, so there's a lot you can talk about with regards to education. Recent trends in education technology, a description of the importance of digital literacy, statistics documenting the lack of home technology for many students, and a selection of expert opinions on the usefulness of technology in all classrooms. So we're not really even getting into our argument yet, but we are contextualizing it. We are providing background. So it's creating the setting for your argument. It provides the place and purpose for the argument to take place. And by situating your argument within a viable context, you create an opportunity to assert yourself into the discussion, as well as give your reader a genuine understanding of your topic's importance. Next, we're into propositio and partitio. So these two concepts function together to help set up your argument. You can think of them functioning together to form a single thesis. The propositio informs your audience of your stance, and the partitio lays out your argument. So, claim, okay, the propositio is your claim, your major claim. Your partitio is, these are the points I'm going to be making in support of my claim. So it's kind of like these two together form your thesis, right? It is, here's my claim. These are the 3 or 4 or 2 or whatever, depending on your time, depending on your research, what you're going to be addressing in your subsequent paragraphs. So the propositio tells your audience what you think about a topic, and the partitio briefly explains why you think that way and how you're going to prove your point. Because this section helps sets up the rest of your argument, you should place it near the beginning of your paper. So it's almost like your second introduction, if that makes sense. Your exordium is your introduction, and then your narratio will probably go in there. And then here, this would be like a subsequent introduction where you're laying out the case. Keep in mind, however, that you should not give away all your information or evidence in your partitio. So you want to be relatively general here. You're not going to get into the specifics until you actually get into the body of the argument. This section should be fairly short, perhaps 3 to 4 sentences at most for most academic essays. You can think of this section of your argument like the trailer for a new film. It should be concise, should entice the audience, and should give them a good example of what they're going to experience, but it shouldn't include every detail. Just as a film goer must see an entire film to gain an understanding of its significance or quality, so too must your audience read the rest of your argument to truly understand its depth and scope. So back to our example of the technology argument. So in the case of your argument on implementing technology in the English classroom, it's important to think not only of your own motivations for pursuing this technology in the classroom, but also of what will motivate or persuade your respective audiences. Keep in mind, part of what we do when we argument is we're really strident in terms of why we want something, but in order to be effective in our argument, we have to either convince our audience or understand what they already want in order to make what we want and what they want match up. So some writing contexts call for an audience of 1. Some require consideration of multiple audiences, in which case you must find ways to craft an argument which appeals to each member of your audience. For example, if your audience included a school board as well as parents and teachers, your propositio might look something like this. The introduction of newer digital technology in the English classroom would be beneficial for all parties involved. Students are already engaged in all kinds of technological spaces, and it is important to implement teaching practices that invest students' interests and prior knowledge. Not only would the marriage of English studies and technology extend pedagogical opportunities, it would also create an ease of instruction for teachers, engage students in creative learning environments, and familiarize students with the creation and sharing technologies that they will be expected to use at their future colleges and careers. Plus, recent studies suggest a correlation between exposure to technology and higher literacy rates, a trend many education professionals say isn't going to change. So, notice how the paragraph that I just read considers the concerns and motivations of all 3 audience members. Okay, so it talks to board members, it talks to teachers, it talks to students. All right, that's pretty thorough, but you've got to keep all of those folks in mind, especially if those are the people you're talking to. So if you think about, right now, we have a bond that was passed in Visalia, and part of that bond was to build a new high school. Well, currently there is not enough money with that bond to build a new high school. which means that the district is going to have to find a way to get the citizens of Visalia to approve yet another bond, which is essentially more money out of their pocket, to complete that project. So they're going to have to convince primarily taxpayers, right? But in the past, they had to convince teachers to, consider whether or not that was going to be a good idea. And bear in mind that for teachers, we are also taxpayers. And we're also figuring, what does this mean exactly for my school if they're building a new high school? How are they going to redraw boundaries? What are the demographic shifts that are going to occur in my school if they build that new high school? So there's a lot of moving parts, and because of that, the speakers in those arguments had to really consider a lot of viewpoints. Now, what's difficult about that is that you're not going to make everybody happy, and so you have to be strategic in whose viewpoints mean the most. So keep in mind that whatever you promise in your propositio and partitio, so in the example I gave, new teaching practices, literacy, statistics, and professional opinion must appear in the body of your argument. So don't make any claims here that you can't prove later in your argument. So propositio is your claim, right? And that is just what do you think? What is your position? Where do you stand on this particular side of the debate? And then the partitio is where you lay out your argument, where you give your major reasons. You have to talk about, if you talk about those in the partitio and you don't talk about any of them in the body of your argument, you've presented a really ineffective argument. So just a tip, in the event that you don't plan effectively as you are preparing your argument on the AP test, make sure that you go back through, reread your argument, and make sure that everything you presented in the partitio is addressed in the argument. If not, just delete it, okay? And what I mean by delete it is you just draw a line through whatever it is that you don't want them to read. So for example, if you presented your claim and 3 reasons, but in the body you only talked about 2 reasons, go back to the claim or go back to the partitio and cross out that reason that you didn't talk about in the argument, okay? All right, confirmatio and refutatio. So this is where you are going to be developing and building the body of your argument. So these two represent different types of proofs that you'll need to consider when you craft your argument. So confirmatio and refutatio work in opposite ways. And at this point, hopefully you've recognized that these words look like confirmation and refutation. There's a reason why. They're cognates. They're both very effective in strengthening your claims. Luckily, both words are cognates, like I just said, words that sound or look familiar in multiple languages and are therefore easy to keep straight. Confirmatio is a way to confirm your claims and is considered a positive proof. Refutatio is a way to acknowledge and refute a counterclaim and is considered a negative proof. The confirmatio is your argument's support, the evidence that helps to support your claims. The refutatio provides negative proofs. This is an opportunity for you to acknowledge that other opinions exist and have merit, while also showing why those claims do not warrant rejecting your argument. So in your confirmatio, for example, in the technology argument, you might include the following things. Students' grades drastically increase when technology is inserted in academics. Teachers widely agree that students are more engaged in classroom activities that involve technology. Another one is students who are accepted to elite colleges generally possess strong technological skills. So those would be confirmation of your claims. Those are all, pro claim essentially. They're in favor of your specific claim. So the confirmatio is your argument support. This is the evidence that helps support your claim. The refutatio provides negative proofs. This is an opportunity for you to acknowledge that other opinions exist and have merit, while also showing why those claims don't warrant rejecting your argument. So you don't have to entirely disprove every single counterclaim, but what you have to do is you have to, like I've highlighted, show why they do not warrant rejecting your argument. If you feel strange including information that seems to undermine or weaken your own claims, ask yourself this. Have you ever been in a debate with someone who entirely disregarded every point you tried to make without considering the credibility of what you said? Did this make their argument less convincing? That's what your paper can look like if you don't acknowledge that other opinions indeed exist and warrant attention. Another note on that is that if you don't want to include information in your refutation, or your refutatio, I should say, because you feel like it weakens your argument, maybe you have a weak argument already. Okay? Keep in mind, we talked a lot about logical appeals and we talked about logical argument, and we have to differentiate between when we have an argument because we can prove it logically or because we just feel like it's right. And there's two very, very different things going on there. And so we have to be logical in our arguments. And sometimes that requires us to go back and reevaluate sort of why we landed where we did on a specific position. So in your refutatio, after you acknowledge the opposing viewpoint, you have two options. And this is a mistake where I see a lot, where students will sometimes acknowledge the opposing viewpoint and then not respond to it, which is dumb, because the whole point of you addressing the opposing viewpoint is so you can attack it and disprove it or show why it does not invalidate your argument. You can either concede the point, which is admit that the point is valid and that you can find no fault with their reasoning, or you can refute it by pointing out the flaws in your opponent's argument. So, for example, if your opponent were to argue that technology is likely to distract students more than help them, which of course is a very valid argument, an argument that you'd be sure to include in your argument so as not to seem ignorant of opposing views, you'd have two options. So, the concession option looks like this. You might concede this point by saying, despite all the potential for positive learning provided by technology, proponents of more traditional classroom materials point out the distractive possibilities that such technology would introduce into the classroom. They argue that distractions such as computer games, social media, and music streaming services would only get in the way of learning. Okay, so bear in mind, I recognize this as well in my own classroom. Okay, when I notice that people are watching Netflix on their phones, when they are listening to music or podcasts or whatever as they are learning, those are distractions, okay? And I acknowledge those things, and those things are a source of frustration to myself and others, as you know, but they do not invalidate necessarily, as far as I'm concerned, the effectiveness of educational technology. So in your concession of the argument, you are acknowledging the merit of the opposing argument, but you've got to try to flip that evidence in a positive way. So note how before conceding, we include, quote, despite all of the potential for positive learning. So you are contextualizing or framing it within the context of your original argument. So you are acknowledging that there are distractions like computer games, social media, music streaming services, but you introduced all of that information with a really effective transition that showed that, one, I am addressing the opposition, and two, I am reminding you of what my argument is, despite all of the potential for positive learning. Okay? So when we talk about transitions, again, be very, very deliberate. The other option is the refutation. So going back to the point we just talked about all the distractions, we're going to refute this same point, and we're going to say something like, while proponents of more traditional English classrooms express concerns about student distraction, again, music, streaming services, games, stuff like that, it's important to realize that in modern times, students are already distracted by the technology they carry around in their pockets. By redirecting student attention to the technology administered by the school, this distraction is shifted to class content. Plus, with website and app blocking resources available to schools, I blocked cool math games, sorry. It is simple for an institution to simply decide which websites and apps to ban and block, thereby ensuring students are on task. Note how we acknowledged the opposing argument, but immediately pointed out its flaws using straightforward logic and a counterexample. Okay. In so doing, we effectively strengthen our argument and move forward with our proposal. And then finally, after we have built up our argument, we've got our exordium, our narratio, we've got everything. We've contextualized the argument, we have laid out the case, we get to our conclusion. Okay, again, for those of you, and I've already heard several of you mention this to me, I hate writing conclusions. Conclusions are really hard. Part of the reason why people say that, I think, is because we haven't really ever been clear about what the purpose of a conclusion is. I know in some cases you've gotten something like, it just makes the essay feel finished. And that's true to a point, but the conclusion is also, especially in rhetorical writing, really, really important because, remember, you're writing to persuade. You are writing to a specific audience. The last thing you want to leave them with is a strong impression that will get them to ideally agree with your argument. So your peroratio is your conclusion. This is your final opportunity to make an impact in your essay and leave an impression on your audience. In this section, you're expected to summarize and reevaluate everything you've proven throughout your argument. However, there are multiple ways of doing this. Depending on the topic of your essay, you might employ one or more of the following in your closing. You may have a call to action, which is encouraging your audience to do something that will change the situation or topic you've been discussing. Now, in a lot of the prompts, it might feel awkward for a call to action because a lot of the prompts are just asking sort of like major philosophical questions. But if you think about those major philosophical questions as being something larger than just analyzing the question itself and applying the ideas that you have been discussing in your argument to your own life or others' lives, this might be a good time to use a call to action. Discuss the implications for the future. What might happen if things continue the way that they're going? Is this good or bad? Try to be impactful without being overly dramatic, okay? Sometimes we confuse like overtly dramatic language with strong diction, and that's not always true, okay? Histrionics can be a real turnoff for people sometimes, so you want to be really, really careful about knowing your audience and knowing how strident you can be and how passionate you can be in your language without kind of distracting from what your major purpose is. You can also discuss other related topics that warrant further research and discussion. You can make a historical parallel regarding a similar issue that can help strengthen your argument. Do not fall into the trap of a false analogy. Make sure that your analogy works, okay? And then you can also urge a continued conversation of the topic for the future. So presenting your argument as just the beginning in a long series of debates makes you sound super smart and kind of like a pioneer. So that's cool. So remember that the peroratio is your last impression that your audience is going to have of your argument. Make sure to consider carefully which rhetorical appeals to employ to gain a desirable effect. Make sure also to summarize your findings, including the most effective and emphatic pieces of evidence from your argument. Reassert your major claim and end on a compelling, memorable note. Do not introduce any new information in this part of your essay. You're just wrapping everything up. It's kind of like a summary, but you want to be rhetorical, you want to be deliberate, you want to be persuasive. Okay? All right. Thanks, everybody.